Assalamu alaikum. How are you,
Alaikum
Sara?
salam. I'm good. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the Blue Sofa Talks. Welcome to the Blue Sofa Talks. I'm your host, Fatima Al-Zain. On this show, we aim to bring females from our community who will share their stories and experiences. This show is really about just getting comfortable, sitting down, having our TMJ coffee, and chatting about the important things, the controversial things, or just the things that really go through our minds. I'm very excited to have with me here Sara Salimi. Sara came all the way down from Toronto to visit us here at the TMJ studio. Sara, can you take us a little bit through your journalism career path from your undergrad to your master's? What did you study?
Absolutely. So I actually started off undergrad as a pre-pharmacy major. So I was taking courses, to go to pharmacy school.
I actually was going to get into engineering. I applied and I got in and I was like, Mom, look, I got in, but I'm actually going to do journalism.
I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. So I was pre-pharmacy and I interned at NIH, pharmacy departments, and I tried to get as much experience I could in that area. And one day I was at NIH and I was working in the pharmacy department. And I had to find basically there would be prescriptions that would come and you had to get the drug. And then they had these cool tubes that would go to the right room. And it was fascinating at first. And I would go every day. And I slowly was like, this is not, the life that I envisioned myself having for years and years to come. And I started to do a lot of soul searching around that time because I was like, is this really what I want to do for the rest of my life? And I realized I'm not the kind of person who can be kind of contained in a room, doing all these tasks and kind of this mechanical work. So I really, through experience, started questioning a lot of what I envisioned my future career to look like. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of reading and research of my own into, social issues and social topics I was interested in. And I said to myself, how come I can't have a career that really makes me passionate every day? I shouldn't have to feel bored of what I'm doing. I want to get out there. I want to do things. I want to discover these stories. And why do I have to separate that from my personal passions?
It's very true.
It was a journey of really discovering what it is I felt I could do with the skills I knew I had and where I felt I could contribute most in terms of what really made me get out of bed every day. So,
and it's very interesting because a lot of people that I've spoken with have gone through this kind of similar career path where they feel, how do I separate my passions from what I'm working as? A lot of people, if they do separate that passion, then their work takes the toll.
Precisely.
Because you're going to have that passion to do things and you're going to keep going to pursue the things that you're passionate about. So, it's very clever that you did do that and you went down that career path instead.
For sure. So that kind of led me to, I took one course in journalism that fall. I was already 2 years in, and I took that course, probably my favorite professor in my undergrad experience. And I fell in love with all that I was studying. And I made the switch that same semester. I had already the electives I had, I could use it for, a specialization in the journalism. So I completed that with a minor in law and society.
Interesting.
And afterwards, I was considering the master's, did a little bit of work, got some experience. And I was like, the area that I really want to specialize with journalism is global and international affairs. So I did that.
That led you to the Iran report.
Yes. The infamous.
Yes, the infamous Iran report. How many months did it take you guys to go through all the research and the edits for that?
I would say everything from start to end, maybe 3 months, 2 to 3 months.
Okay.
It was a journey, really. It was probably the most comprehensive and extensive report I've ever worked on.
Harder than your master's.
For sure. I had to use content from my TMJ Iran report for my master's thesis.
Amazing.
I was so proud of that. And it was really, I think, probably one of my most valuable works. And I'm really proud of having worked on it with TMJ.
Alhamdulillah. So I have 2 things that I want to discuss with you. The first is taking a career path that, I mean, journalism is a very lonely career sometimes, because you do have to stand on your own in some things that you are saying. So I think it's very valuable that we are able to find like-minded voices, within our communities that can uplift our values. And you're one of those voices. You're a very valuable voice at TMJ. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. I'm really happy I was able to join like-minded people. Yeah. That was probably one of the most important things for me, is finding a group that I know shares the worldview I do. And that's rare these days.
And it's hard for a woman in hijab to be in these kinds of industries and careers. So my question to you is, what made you decide to work with an organization like TMJ rather than work for a big corporation?
So I think that was my biggest dilemma as my journalism undergrad was coming to a close. A lot of our workshops and kind of seminars we would have was encouraging students, because the biggest kind of metric of success after journalism school is how top shot can you get? How fast can you climb that ladder? Go quickly, get those connections. And a lot of times when I would read into, for example, New York Times or, CNN, Washington Post, Fox News, all these top shots, I found that there was such a big drive among Muslims to make it to the top that sometimes we compromised what we found was most valuable to report on. I remember the conversations I would have with my professors or even students in my journalism classes. I always felt there was a gap in terms of what it is that I found valuable covering versus everything that news organizations are after. And it's that breaking news, that sensationalized news, the clickbait, how fast can we publish things that everyone will just inhale? And for me, it was, is that more valuable to me as a Muslim woman in this field? Or do I find more value in being maybe a smaller voice, but a growing organization that is at least catering to my worldview and what I find value in talking about?
And the God-centric worldview is not something you'll find in news.
It's not. And I think one issue I had a lot with my own journalism school was there was such an emphasis on, as a journalist, you cannot take sides. And I would get into arguments with my professors, but the unbiased truth has a side.
The unbiased argument.
Exactly.
You have to be unbiased in everything that you say.
And it's funny, because even when you look at these top shot news organizations, there's always a bias. That's why everyone's like, oh, Fox News thinks this way, CNN thinks this way, because people recognize that there is an agenda in even the most quote unquote unbiased news organizations.
Yeah.
So why not? What really attracted me to TMJ was how you emphasize the identity, the Muslim identity, as part of that news reporting. And that's something I've never seen, because it's automatically, if you bring your religion into your reporting, you're biased. But how is that bias if my religion is my metric?
Informs your worldview.
It's my metric of objective truth.
Yes.
Because the truth has a side. Whether we like it or not, you can't ignore that.
So speaking about the truth has a side, I think you know where I'm getting.
Yes.
So when you first, when this whole report was brought to you, or when you kind of started this journey, and we're mentioning the Iran report that is published on the TMJ News website. Sara is the author of that report. So Sara, when you went into this journey, the piece that you started with, was it anything like the outcome or the piece that's published?
Somewhat similar, but I would say if you look at it in its entirety, almost unrecognizable from the beginning. I remember when I first started drafting it, I was so excited. I'm like, yes, I have this down. Everything's great. And then all the edits came in. And all the, you need to change this part. You need to think more about this part. So if you look at what it was in the beginning, it's almost, you can't tell that that's the same report as what ended up being published. And you would assume that that's, a negative thing. But I learned in this process that it's probably the most valuable aspect of doing true journalism is recognizing that in this process, you're also growing.
Yeah.
And you have to find the holes in your own bias before you can produce a work that's valuable.
So you have to kind of go through your own journey to improve yourself and your idea of the world in order to be able to see that kind of truth.
Exactly. And I experienced that with, I think we laugh about it now, but in that moment, especially when the topic is fresh and everyone's talking about it and there's so much drama surrounding it.
And you're Iranian as well, so you have family in Iran. What did your family members tell you at the beginning, and how did you kind of implement? What things did you choose to implement from what they were saying?
I think one thing we have to acknowledge in the journalism world is that viewpoints always exist. And for the people who have them, they're very real.
Yeah.
So we can't come and tell someone that your opinion or your viewpoint is wrong, but we can tell them that what you feel may not be a complete reflection of the truth. You can feel your feelings, but that's not always what's happening on the ground in real life. So I think with my family too, and I think everyone, all the Iranians I know, at least friends and family, they can attest that their family in Iran has a range of different views on the socio-political atmosphere, rightfully so, because they live there. But you can also have disagreements even with your own family members when it comes to that objective side to things.
Do you feel this kind of responsibility that it's like a very heavy weight on you that you have to not upset them?
Family
as well? Yeah.
That's a part of every almost piece that I write that remotely has anything to do with Iran or my own family.
Because I can imagine if I was in your position trying to write a story about something that's happening in Lebanon and I have family there who's like, no, you need to write it this way because this is what's going on.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult for me to overcome that and kind of take a step back, because remember, you're inside a bubble, right? And you have to kind of look from the outside and then step back in.
Exactly. It's definitely difficult. I definitely have gotten into, I wouldn't say arguments, civilized conversations with family about disagreements. And that happens naturally in any Iranian gathering. But when it comes to now reporting on it, it's a matter of objectivity and truth. So in those conversations, you end up offending some people and you end up, befriending some people. And that's a reality of life. I think for me, what was most important is I shouldn't base my objectivity and what I find to be true based on what I read and what I come to satisfy or make others happy, because by that metric, I could never make everyone happy.
Yeah, it's very true. Did you have people that reached out to you and told you that they were very upset?
Not that many, to be very honest.
That's good.
I expected a lot more. They might silently hate me, which is fine too.
I don't think so. I feel like if you did come from that lens of being objective. And like you said, the truth does have a side. And it's hard to write something and not feel okay with it afterwards. So did you feel that kind of like calmness after you were done?
I did. And I think a part of the reason is I know that I had to struggle in a lot of places too. I knew that, for example, when Zainab or you would give me topics or things that I should think about more, or suggestions that I should implement, or feedback from consultants, a lot of times I would tell myself, I should know more about this than anyone else. It's that ego that sometimes gets to your head of, I'm Iranian, then I must definitely be an expert in all things.
That has to do with this topic.
Exactly. And you have to realize that's not true. It's like I see this a lot in comments where Iranians are saying, oh, you don't even live in Iran. You shouldn't have an opinion about what's going on. But I'm a human being. I can see things. I can think about it. I can witness what's happening around my world and connect dots. And that was the whole point of the report, is I'm viewing this from the lens of an American born and raised citizen, but my roots are Iranian.
Yeah.
I have the right to think about the interconnectivity between the US and Iran, the world and Iran, because it's never an isolated country where we can say this is all the truth and it's all here.
It's very true.
It's very connected to almost all parts of the world, especially with Iran as a country that's probably been historically the most, misunderstood because of everything that's been going on globally and all the sanctions and all the, hate it's gotten. So for me, it was a process of coming to realize that I need to sometimes fight my own ego to produce a work that I think is pure in intention. I had to rethink a lot of my bias. I had to, sit down sometimes with myself and say, you need to read this with fresh eyes. You need to think about it from a different perspective. You need to see all those different viewpoints that exist.
Who helped you to kind of take a step back and rethink and come back to the writing table?
I think in this process, my husband has seen me through all these different, I guess, phases. Every time there's a new edit, I'm like, oh, there's another one. I need to sit down and think about it in a different lens. And he would see that sometimes frustration. And, he would always encourage me. He's like, this is a natural part of this process. And when I would explain to him why this means so much to me, he's really my biggest support system. And so it meant so much that I could, have that support and know that I can contribute meaningfully at the same time growing myself in the process.
And I'm looking at this with that bigger picture as well, not just one specific report or one specific thing, but I love what you're saying about really taking a step back from anything you're doing in life, checking your ego, and having others check in with you as well, or help to support you so you're going on the right path.
Exactly.
Right? That has to do with religion too. How did you spiritually grow through this report and through your journalism career?
I think the spiritual aspect of it came by checking myself. In the beginning, I think with every report, I've never had this active spiritual journey with my journalism. I think it was something I had to grow into. And it happened mostly after journalism school, where I was on this search for where do I find the most meaning in contributing my skills to. And even in the process of coming to TMJ and building a connection here, I think what was most important to me was that God-centric lens. And I think when you have that God-centric lens as the foundation for your work, it automatically brings a sense of spiritual awakening as well, where every time you're doing a work, every time you're doing a report, you're also thinking about what would make God the most happy from me. If I'm publishing this, am I making God happy, or am I making A, B, or C happy, right? I think it makes you question where really you find the most value in your work. We're going to one day all go on, but the writing stays. It stays for generations. And if we're going to leave a lasting impact, then that spiritual journey is also important.
And the part you mentioned about, where is this going? Who am I doing it for? It's kind of like following the money trails, in journalism. Who are the biggest organizations that lead everything? And why was there such a narrative that was framed, and how did it get framed in that kind of way? And these are the most important questions to ask, right? But when your money is going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're writing something that is for the greater good.
Exactly, yeah.
It's not for your own ego or your own gain, or for a company's gain, or for someone else's gain. It's for Allah.
And I think you can speak to this too with your own experience. And I think print journalism, multimedia, all of this, it's the same concept in different ways. And I think you can also attest to the fact that you, even though, you're mostly involved in that video and the visuals, the same concept really applies.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting, because when I did my, my work at, the organizations that I worked at in my undergrad school years, it was when I sat down at the table the first day, they were like, a lot of people come through here and they don't write stories, so you should write stories every week. I was like, okay. But every story I pitched got turned down. And I kept wondering, like, am I pitching the wrong stories? Am I giving the wrong perspectives? Like, what do they want? I have to fit their narratives. I have to fit what they want from me and from the stories that I'm pitching. How do I reframe this? I was sitting and just like scrolling through different news things. I got into like crypto and like, I don't know what.
The kind of news,
like I didn't know what they wanted me to pitch to them anymore. And any story that I had to pitch that had to do with hijab or had to do with Muslims, it was always it would always get changed in a way that it was from the outside perspective of the white savior.
Exactly.
Which I found so interesting. Every single one, every single time, without fail, it would come to the white savior.
We are the ones saving you. And that's so interesting because...
And liberation.
Exactly.
And freedom.
And that's the same concept that has been used so much for the imperialistic gains of Western countries and other nations. It's not that women who are hijabi in the Middle East, for example, are respected because they're making an independent and dignified choice. They're being respected because we can just use your covering as another excuse for our own ends.
And I was told that actually straight out. I was told, you should apply because we need more people like you.
Looking like you.
That look
wearing
like you.
What you wear.
Exactly.
Not because you bring a fresh line to the table, but because, we checked off the diversity. And that's, I think, really a big testament to how I started seeing the media world, where a woman who is hijabi, if your stories are getting rejected, that means it's your mind and your thoughts that they have a problem with.
Yeah.
You can look however you want to look. And if you look visibly Muslim, it's better for us because we're gonna get even more points for being inclusive.
Yeah.
But really, when you start to add a perspective that differs from that mainstream or that agenda we have, you're a problem.
And there are a lot of, I think, visible female journalists who are very respectable, who are doing amazing work. But I think you do have to compromise a bit of your values and the stories that you do tell sometimes in order to fit that mainstream narrative. Because you can never make the mainstream happy if you're telling your full truth.
Exactly. And I think that's a choice every individual has to make with themselves. I don't think I would ever say someone who has different aspirations in terms of their career. For example, if my goal was to get to the New York Times, if that's really my dream, that's amazing, go for it. But I think for me, it was more of a conversation of, is that really my biggest potential?
Is the question that we have to ask ourselves in everything in life is this bringing me closer to God?
Exactly. I think that's the game changer in all of this. I think it really, when you start to see from that perspective, it aligns your career aspirations in a very different orientation than just simply being present, rather being present in a much more meaningful way.
But it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
It's hard to actually be actively doing this and then working in this kind of like godless world that we live in now.
And I think what I think about with this conversation too is, aside from just my own career, like when I speak to you and Zainab or like-minded individuals who really share that ideology I do, it empowers me much more than just having conversations with coworkers whose only real, idea of fun or entertainment is happy hour or the cruise they're going on in the weekend with their family. When I speak to you or when I speak to Zainab, I can have hours and hours of a conversation, and at the end of it, I feel more empowered to implement my own faith in my career. It doesn't work the other way around for me. And so I think when I also ask, what kind of an environment are my kids going to be raised into? What kind of career will my children look up to? What kind of acquaintances will they want to have? I think for me, it's more about just the career. It's also, what community am I building around me, and how similar in thought are we? How much are we really trying to achieve something that has really not been given that much attention in the Western world?
And it always comes back to your children in the end, Every conversation I have comes back to, what world will my children live in?
Exactly.
So it's I think we're going down a path that is very hard and lonely sometimes, but alhamdulillah, I think with more people who will give value to their own values and their morals and to having that God-centric vision, we will get closer to that path.
Exactly. And I think that's really what TMJ meant to me when I was interested in joining. I remember I DM'd Zainab. That's how I was interested. It was when you were in the beginning of when you were starting to cover the protests in Iran. And for me, it was, I'm seeing the same exact things on CNN. I'm seeing the same things on...
And you know what's interesting is that there is never a time where you see the exact same narrative and story on every single news platform.
Exactly. It happens time and time again with Iran. It's kind of been... Because every time a protest erupts, I'm like, oh, all these news organizations are going to start echoing the exact same narrative, and I'm not here for it. I think you can acknowledge that a lot of it, yes, you can speak about in the same way. But at the same time, I was always looking for an organization or a fresh lens on issues that wasn't just trying to say the same things everyone is saying. Because then you're really just speaking into an echo chamber and you're not offering anything really of value.
Yeah.
So I think what really changed it for me was, okay, these people are looking at it from a lens that I don't normally see.
And a lens that I value. And mentioning the echo chamber, it's a very dangerous type of echo chamber, because usually the echo chamber is just like you hear the voice over and over and over. But this one is an echo chamber that actually causes an uprising and causes riots and causes, so much, I want to say, uproar in a country,
Exactly.
And not just in that country, but all over the world towards that country.
Absolutely.
How did you manage with everything? So this is your own personal self. How did you manage, being Iranian in this kind of political climate?
I think with every protest that happens in Iran, there's suddenly an uproar on social media. And obviously all of your friend circles are taking different sides of that, different perspectives. Mm-hmm. One thing that was very interesting for me is seeing all of this kind of overload of information. And every time I was seeing, for example, I would see factually incorrect information, or even I would sometimes read something and I would be so surprised. Mm. So for example, the whole poll that we had as part of the report.
Farce news.
And I was saying to myself, oh, if this is something that's leaked from Farce News, it's a news agency. Yeah. It's an Iranian government news agency. So it must be correct. Legitimate. Mm-hmm. They must have, because it was a study about, a poll that was done in, with a group of people around the country about their views on whether hijab should be mandatory or not in society. And I read that and I was like, wow, there's really a huge proportion of people who don't want it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this is as correct as it gets. So I added it in the report. I'm like, oh, this is another side that we should consider. And I was so taken aback when, we had the consultant tell us that this report was, even the leaked document was tampered with for a specific purpose, to say, oh, even the government knows it. But they're,
But what can you trust then?
That's the question. And I think that's the reason why journalism and journalists themselves have to be so cognizant of it, because as a news consumer, I can easily fall for anything I see, especially with this whole...
You can't blame people for following these narratives and following what they're hearing.
Exactly. It's what seems like it's the most, and usually we tend to accept the news that confirms our own
and
viewpoints.
Polls are facts, these are, and it was very convincing.
It's kind of like the argument of you can basically manipulate science to support any possible scenario. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this because even research nowadays is partisan, right? It's biased. It depends on the donors, depends on, the mainstream viewpoint. It's the same thing with news. You can essentially use numbers and data to prove anything you want. And usually in these kinds of situations, you see people going after the data that supports their own personal viewpoints. And that is actually something that journalists, I think, have to be so careful of not falling into. Because with that poll, I was surprised to see it. And then I had to go research and look into it myself, look at previous polls and realize those numbers don't match. Yeah. It doesn't seem like it's logically following in that direction. So I had to really sit down and say, wow, even the things that we think are the most true can be false.
Manipulated.
Exactly.
Can be very, it's very alarming.
Especially in an age of disinformation and misinformation. I think being a responsible news consumer and sharer has become more important than ever.
So my final question, Sara, is how can the youth in our communities help to inform their parents? And how can their parents help to inform them? I think because, our parents a lot of times are the ones that tell us this is not really what's going on in these countries. They've lived in these countries. They know from themselves.
Exactly. I climbed mountains to get to school. I know this.
Yeah. That's so funny. But how can we help to inform our parents with these kinds of media literacy or different forms? I mean, you tell me, how can we help them to read or dissect news for our youth and for our parents?
I definitely think in every generation, there's a lot of valuable things to take away. I think we often like to think that, our parents' generation doesn't know how to consume news. Yeah. We have to inform them. I think they do know based on, their own experiences, how they intake that information and how they process it. I think with this generation, we are increasingly consuming news through social media.
We have TikTok, we have Instagram, we have YouTube Shorts now, we have
Reels,
Twitter, we have so many different things that are giving you information everywhere. I think it's an information overload for people.
Pretty much, and that's why it's different because our parents' generation, newspapers were the thing. Now it's moving away from the print journalism and more on that digital side. And it comes with pros and cons. You have overload of information, but you also have an overload of misinformation. Yeah. And being able to distinguish has become much harder. So I think the younger generation can really help with that aspect of once you are able to practice those news consuming habits that are, healthy and more objective than subjective.
And how do you start with that? Consuming all media or consuming specific media that you trust?
I think vetting out sources that are more trustable than others. It's difficult to say this source is 100%.
Of course,
good.
there is no.
The only
source
one is
that's
TMJ so far. But other than TMJ,
you're not biased at all.
Still a lot of work to get done. But you can't really ever say this is perfect. So I think you have to learn to accept that I might get an article or a news segment from this source that is closer to the truth than another source, but on another topic, that same source might be biased.
Yeah.
So that becomes more difficult, but I think you can get closer to, these outlets might be closer to that objectivity.
Yeah.
And it comes
with you making those own decisions for yourself.
Exactly.
Using your mind.
Precisely. And I think that's, something that this generation can really emphasize to our parents' generation too. And we can learn from our parents that simplicity aspect. Because, we don't have to feel that we need to get the news from everywhere. You have, a diverse set of things you look at, but you don't have to overload yourself to be an informed individual in society. Yeah. You often find that people who are most intelligent about social matters are not necessarily the ones consuming everything on social media. They're not necessarily the ones, resharing everything they see. They're not the one. Sometimes they're the ones who are reading more than they're sharing.
But there's also this guilt that goes up, that goes along with this, where someone will reach out to you and be like, how could you not share this post about this?
It's the guilt tripping.
Yeah.
I think that's a toxic way of thinking, to be honest. Yeah. And I've seen it a lot with the Iran situation, where people will get called out for not reposting.
Or for reposting.
Mind your business. If you really think that's the height of activism, then you do your activism. People have different ways of contributing to activism. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes it's between them and their God. And I think it's judgmental to think that everyone practices it in the same way. And it's this toxic thing of, everyone, now that they're jumping on the bandwagon, I have to do it too. And a lot of times even Muslims will feel pressured to do that. They'll say, maybe if I just put one thing, then I'll be off the hook. I won't get targeted.
My actual final question for you is, what is your advice for all the Iranian girls out there who are, looking at media, feeling unportrayed, and feeling alone?
I think there will come a day, and I really believe this, where it won't be hard for Iranian girls, especially those who are not always after fitting into the mainstream, to feel that they're represented. And I think that's the value of grassroots organizations that place more focus on, even if they're saying something that's completely different from the tide of society, but they're brave enough to say it, and they'll take the heat. And I think a lot of times, for example, if you look at a lot of the comments under TMJ posts, you realize even if one or two people are feeling like they're seen,
like they're heard,
that's a huge step. Sometimes we think the success comes if we have the most numbers. No. It's really, even if you're able to, with truthful reporting, touch one soul and help them see something differently or help them feel seen, you're doing a lot more than you think. And that has a ripple effect. And I think that just grows with time and with pure intentions.
So what do you say to your younger self?
I want
your advice.
I think to my younger self, I would say, don't feel like you have to fit in everywhere. And I think Mariam actually mentioned to you in your first episode, she said it so beautifully. She said, you don't have to fit in. And I think as young Muslim girls, since we look so different, we think that the success...
We already don't fit in.
Exactly. We think that the success is, I already look different, so I should fit in every other aspect. But I think when you decide, and this takes some maturity and experience to realize, I think difference is valuable. And the fact that we don't have to all say the same things. And as a Muslim woman, I can be proud and I can feel dignified to say things that are not mainstream. And I can say something that I truly believe in without having to fear consequences. I think that's valuable and I think that's precious. And to my younger self, I would say you should be brave to do that.
Thank you so much.
Of course,
you guys heard it from Sara. Be brave. And thank you for listening to our episode of the Blue Sofa Talks. We're here for you.